In 1896, William James stood before a room full of angry philosophers and dropped a bombshell that changed everything. You don't need proof to believe in something. Sometimes the very act of believing is what makes it real. The audience was stunned. Some called it dangerous. Others said he had just handed suicidal people a reason to keep living. Tonight, in Part 7, the complete story of the will to believe, how one idea saved millions from despair, and why Harvard almost fired him for being too radical. Stay until the very end, because the last 30 seconds will change how you make every major decision for the rest of your life. As William James advanced further into his studies at Harvard, his interests began to focus more sharply on the intersection of philosophy and psychology. Though psychology as a formal discipline was still in its infancy, William sensed the importance of understanding the human mind in both scientific and experiential terms. He realized that questions about consciousness, perception, and habit were not merely philosophical curiosities. They were central to understanding human life. His early observations of people, combined with his training in art and science, provided him with a unique perspective that he would later develop into pioneering work. One of the key influences during this period was the study of physiology. William was fascinated by the connections between the brain, the nervous system, and mental activity. Laboratory work allowed him to witness how physical processes underlie behavior and sensation. Yet he also noticed that science alone could not explain the full richness of human experience. Emotions, thoughts, moral judgments, and subjective feelings could not be reduced entirely to physiology. This realization encouraged him to explore a more integrated approach, combining empirical observation with philosophical reflection, a method that would define his later psychological studies. In parallel, William engaged deeply with philosophical texts. He explored the ideas of empiricism and rationalism, considering how knowledge is acquired and validated. He examined the writings of thinkers like John Locke, David Hume, and Immanuel Kant, comparing their views on perception, experience, and consciousness. These studies sharpened his analytical skills and encouraged him to ask questions that bridged science and philosophy. How can we understand the self? What is the relationship between mind and body? How do habits shape human behavior? These questions became central to his later work in psychology and philosophy. William also reflected on his own personal development. He recognized that his early experiences of travel, family influence, and education had shaped his habits of observation, thought, and reflection. He realized that understanding the mind required not only external study. Observing his own thoughts, feelings, and responses allowed him to test hypotheses about consciousness and human behavior. This practice of introspection became a critical tool in his later research and writing, helping him articulate the complexity of mental life in ways that combined clarity and empathy. Social observation remained a key part of his education. William noticed patterns in human interaction, the influence of upbringing, environment, and personal disposition on behavior. He watched how students learned, how professors taught, and how people responded to social pressures. These experiences reinforced the importance of considering context in understanding human thought and action. He began to see that psychology must account for both individual variability and environmental influence, a view that anticipated his later theories of habit and consciousness. During this period, William also experimented with early forms of psychological investigation. Though formal laboratories and methods were not yet fully developed, he observed human behavior carefully, recorded findings, and tested ideas about perception and thought. He noted how attention, memory, and habit influenced action, and he considered the role of emotion in decision-making. These early experiments, though informal, provided him with experience in both observation and interpretation, laying the groundwork for the rigorous methods he would later employ in experimental psychology. His artistic training continued to influence his perspective. The patience, precision, and attention to detail he had learned in drawing allowed him to perceive subtle aspects of human expression and behavior. He could notice small gestures, changes in tone, and variations in attention that others might overlook. These abilities were crucial in both his philosophical analysis and his psychological observation. Art had trained him to observe closely and think critically about what he saw, skills that proved invaluable in the study of the mind. William also faced challenges in balancing his diverse interests. The tension between philosophy, science, literature, and moral questions sometimes caused doubt and hesitation. Yet he gradually learned that these disciplines were complementary rather than conflicting. By integrating the methods of science, the questions of philosophy, and the observational skills of art, he could approach human experience in a holistic way. This integrative approach became a defining feature of his intellectual style, allowing him to tackle complex problems with depth and clarity. By the end of this stage, William James had developed both the skills and the perspective necessary to pursue professional studies in philosophy and psychology. He had combined careful observation, scientific analysis, philosophical reflection, and artistic sensitivity into a coherent method of inquiry. He understood the importance of self-examination, social observation, and empirical investigation. These qualities prepared him to contribute original ideas to the study of consciousness, human behavior, and moral experience, establishing the foundation for his later influence as a teacher, writer, and thinker. Page 3 of Chapter 2 emphasizes William James's deepening engagement with philosophy and the early development of psychological insight. His Harvard years were marked by careful study, observation, reflection, and experimentation, all of which prepared him to bridge the gap between scientific investigation and philosophical inquiry. This period represents a key stage in his growth as a thinker capable of integrating diverse fields of knowledge into a coherent and practical understanding of human life. As William James continued his studies at Harvard, he began to take his first steps toward a professional life, exploring career options and areas of specialization. Though his interests were broad, he increasingly recognized that the study of the mind offered a unique opportunity to combine science, philosophy, and human observation. This realization encouraged him to pursue more systematic work in areas that would later define psychology and philosophy as disciplines in America. One area that captured his attention was the relationship between habit and human behavior. William observed that much of daily life is governed not by conscious choice but by patterns of habit. He noticed these patterns in himself, in his classmates, and in the people around him. Habits shaped thought, decision-making, and moral action. Understanding habit, he realized, could provide insights into both personal development and social behavior. This early focus on habit became a cornerstone of his later work, influencing his theories on education, ethics, and psychology. During these years, William also deepened his engagement with scientific experimentation. He studied the methods of physiology and anatomy, observing the processes of the human body with careful attention. Experiments in sensory perception and attention revealed to him the complexities of experience and the ways in which the mind organizes and interprets information. He learned to combine observation with analysis, recording subtle details of behavior and responses. This approach laid the groundwork for his future contributions to experimental psychology, which would emphasize careful measurement and systematic study. At the same time, William remained committed to philosophical reflection. He explored questions about consciousness, free will, and moral responsibility. Philosophy helped him frame the observations he made in scientific and social contexts. By combining empirical evidence with reflective analysis, he began to develop a coherent understanding of the mind and its interaction with the external world. His philosophical inquiries were not merely theoretical. They were closely tied to the practical realities of human experience. William's social awareness continued to deepen. He studied the influence of culture, education, and environment on thought and behavior. Harvard exposed him to a diverse range of students and faculty, providing opportunities to observe different approaches to learning, discussion, and moral reasoning. He noticed the interplay between personal temperament, social pressure, and intellectual development. These observations reinforced his understanding that human behavior is complex and cannot be fully explained by any single factor. This holistic perspective became central to his psychological theories. In addition to academic studies, William remained reflective about his own personal growth. He recognized that self-awareness is critical to understanding the mind. By observing his own thoughts, emotions, and reactions, he gained insight into general patterns of human behavior. This practice of introspection allowed him to connect subjective experience with objective observation, bridging the gap between philosophy and science. It was this dual approach, introspective and empirical, that would later define his psychological methods. William also observed the practical effects of education on the mind. He noticed how different teaching methods, classroom structures, and social expectations influenced attention, motivation, and understanding. These observations informed his later work on pedagogy and habit formation. He believed that education should cultivate not only knowledge but also the capacity for reflective thought, moral judgment, and self-control. His insights from Harvard's academic environment helped him understand how systematic instruction and observation could foster intellectual and moral development. During this period, William's relationships with professors and peers played a significant role in shaping his intellectual development. He engaged in discussions that challenged his assumptions and expanded his understanding of different fields. Mentors encouraged him to think critically, question established ideas, and integrate multiple sources of knowledge. These interactions taught him the value of dialogue, debate, and collaborative learning skills that he would later employ as a teacher and author. By the end of this stage at Harvard, William James had developed a rich and integrated approach to the study of mind and behavior. His combination of scientific rigor, philosophical reflection, social observation, and introspection provided a strong foundation for his later work. He had begun to see how different fields, science, philosophy, art, and social study, could be brought together to understand human experience more fully. These insights would guide him as he moved toward professional studies and original research in psychology. Page 4 of chapter 2 emphasizes William James's integration of philosophy, science, and personal observation into a coherent approach to understanding human behavior. His early Harvard years were a time of experimentation, reflection, and refinement of methods. He began to see patterns in habit, attention, and consciousness, preparing the way for his later contributions to psychology, philosophy, and the study of moral and intellectual life. And when the world finally read The Will to Believe, William James became the most famous philosopher in America overnight. But fame brought money, invitations, and a secret temptation that almost destroyed his marriage. In Part 8, you'll discover the forbidden love letters that were hidden for 100 years, and how one woman forced him to choose between his family and his philosophy. Part 8 tomorrow, 8 p.m. sharp. Subscribe plus bell on. This story is about to get even darker.